Hello, I'm David Hepworth. Thanks for clicking this word in your ear, the latest of hundreds of chats Mark, Ellen and I have had over recent years, some between ourselves and others with musicians, authors, comedians, and other people we like. If you'd like to help make sure they continue, you might consider being a Patreon supporter by visiting patreon.com/wordinyourear, or just by liking or subscribing in whatever way you prefer. On with the show.
Well, welcome to another edition of Word in Your Ear. We've both been reading this memoir, These Foolish Things, by an old pal of ours from our days in magazines, and we both thought the same thing. Is there anybody on God's green earth that he hasn't met? This is the world's most gregarious and best connected man, Dylan Jones. Dylan, it's lovely to see you.
Hello.
We should
he said cautiously.
So this is your memoir. You must have had a list of alternative titles somewhere. I refuse to believe you don't have a foolscap pad full of alternative titles. Now I want to know what they were.
Well, usually I'm very quick with book titles, because obviously you need a book title in order to sell it. This, and possibly because it wasn't my idea, I really struggled with the title. The title came right towards the end, as nothing that I came up with seemed to be appropriate. So I actually really struggled with this. In the end, I actually quite like it, but it took a long while.
So whose idea was the book if it wasn't yours?
I finished at Condé Nast a couple of years ago, and when I did, my agent said that it's time for you to write your book. And I said I didn't want to, because I love writing books. I love writing about other people. And occasionally I sort of tease things that have happened to me in my life that are appropriate to the subject into the books. And so I didn't really feel like I had much more to say. And I didn't really want to write a book about me. But he pestered, and I'm glad he did. We got a deal, which is great. And then I wrote the book. And when I finished the book, which is broadly about work, I showed it to 5 people. I showed it to my agent, Andreas, who bought it from Little Brown. And I showed it, obviously, to my wife and my 2 grown-up daughters. And independently, they all said exactly the same thing. They said, you need to make it more personal, which I don't think I had done. And so I spent a long time rewriting it and making it a very different book.
Right. So the presumably part of the kind of publishers, I always think the interesting thing in dealing with publishers is looking at what they tell the book trade the book is about, because that's what you're expected to deliver.
Sure.
Yeah, they wanted something with, you say it's about work, but it's about very star-studded work, isn't it? And it's about. Go on.
That's the other thing. I knew what they wanted, of course. They wanted a book about famous people, and again, I didn't really want to write about that. And it always takes me back to, I remember once, about 20 years ago, and my wife and I went round for Sunday lunch with a photographer. A perfectly nice lunch. And then after lunch, we got a guided tour of his house, and which was full of photographs. And every photograph was a photograph of him with someone famous.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, if you go to all of these famous people's houses, they're not going to have a picture of him. I just thought the whole thing was terribly self-aggrandizing and kind of awful. So there are a lot of famous people in the book, but then it's not meant to be, look who I've met. It's meant to be showing the wiring of celebrity culture over the last 40 years, I suppose.
Right.
But you've still got a powerful urge to want to meet those people, haven't you? So why wouldn't you want to write about them? I mean, you're very excited by the idea. We all are, of being in the presence of celebrity.
I think there's a difference now. I am fascinated still as a journalist. My curiosity to meet really important, bold-faced names is undiminished, as it should be. It's just that world is now populated by dozens of strata of very, very uninteresting, famous people. So I suppose the older you get, the people you want to meet and connect with and interview is just become even more elevated, because they are fewer and fewer, I think, because I do think that sort of age, that sort of the narrative arc of the post-war period is sort of coming to an end. And consequently, the most interesting people tend to be the people who have been around for a very, very long time. And I think, as I point out in the book, the really interesting people are people like Shirley MacLaine and Michael Caine, people who have been famous forever, and they tend to be the nicest people.
But it's also because in those days, fame seemed to be incredibly hard to achieve, whereas nowadays it appears to be simpler. And also, you can be famous nowadays within your silo, can't you? You can be massively famous and still walk down the high street and nobody knows who you are. Whereas Michael Caine, Shirley MacLaine, whatever,
universally famous.
And there's also that thing, I don't know if you agree, that I've always felt that it's impossible to be really impressed with people who weren't really big when you were young. You know, when you come across, if you want to meet a famous footballer, meet somebody who was a famous footballer when you were 14.
So true.
Not somebody who's famous right now, because you readily accept they're famous, but you will not be impressed in the same way.
I think that's completely true, and I think that I find the whole fascination around Taylor Swift as fascinating as every journalist. I actually gave my tickets to my daughter, who went on Sunday with a friend and said it was the most extraordinary thing she'd ever seen. I also spoke to a friend of mine who's a similar age to me, who had exactly the same experience, but he was slightly removed from it because he was experiencing the phenomenon, but he didn't have that kind of emotional connection. He also said she played 46 songs and they all sounded exactly the same, which I think is unfair. But
46, you have delighted us quite enough, I would have thought. It doesn't matter who it is, really, does it?
That's great and enough, yeah.
It is.
So let's go back to the beginning. I mean, were you one of those kids who grew up obsessed with the world of magazines, this kind of far-off world that you only read about in magazines?
Yeah, I was as obsessed with that world as I think lots of people were at a similar age about anything that takes you out of your present condition. And I think this is particularly true of people who weren't born in London, and weirdly, even more so of people who were born sort of just outside London, because it's that glamorous world of media, of people, of connection, of nightclubs and fancy drinks is just a little bit out of reach.
It's just over the rise, isn't it?
It's High Wycombe, wasn't it? You
Paul
were from?
Weller. It's Paul Weller in Woking or whatever.
Yeah.
David Bowie, isn't it? Well, I suppose he was nearer. Yeah.
It's that idea that you can see it, but you can't touch it, and that becomes very, very attractive when you're a teenager. I mean, I think we've all experienced that, and I don't think that goes away. I think it's different these days because you have access to a different world through social media, and I think it's easier to create your persona through social media. Whereas when we were kids, or when I was a teenager, all you had was yourself and a rather immature attempt to sort of dress up and kind of dress in a way that you want to be seen, I suppose.
So you, talking about creating your persona, the kind of sliding doors moment for you is probably going to Chelsea College of Art in 1977.
Yeah.
And you go there from High Wycombe, and it's all the main kind of cultural points are Bowie and Reed and Warhol. And you talk about also your obsession with the 1960s and the swinging 60s. Were you kind of consciously trying to create, in those brilliant chapters early on, Blitz Club and all that, the idea that this was a kind of swinging 80s? And you were thinking, I'm now part of something that people will make documentaries about in years to come.
No, I think that would be incredibly conceited. But I think that I think that my conceitedness came a little later, but I think coming to London at that point in the mid-70s, mid to late 70s, I think through consuming pop media largely, things like the NME, you knew that was the second iteration of Swinging London, because everything was happening. It wasn't just happening in London, but it was driven by London. And hopefully that comes across in the book. The being in London in 1977 was just the most intoxicating thing. I couldn't quite believe it. It was everything I thought being in London would be, but more. And I genuinely loved it. And I try to reflect that in the book. In the 80s, I think you're completely right that when we were working for style magazines, we not only knew that our remit was writing about the third iteration of Swinging London, but we did very conceitedly think that we were part of it, that we were driving it, that we were in it. And I think actually that gave the whole thing more energy, or at least the magazines that we were contributing to.
Right. Was it in either of those times, either the 70s or the 80s, was it, could you wander around London and would you see people you thought, oh, they belong in my world, or they're part of this scene that you wouldn't have read about anywhere else? Is that true?
No, you wouldn't see them in daylight. You see them in nightclubs. I remember once being in Cambridge Circus in the early 80s, maybe 83, 84, seeing Leigh Bowery in daylight and being absolutely horrified. Was this huge man.
Inches of pancake.
White smock. And it was just weird because it was out of context, because in those days, you'd go to nightclubs and you could know people for years and you had no idea what they did.
Yeah.
You had no idea what their surnames were, but you just inhabited this kind of mad world, which somehow gave you a sort of cultural sustenance. It was weird. There was a point which luckily coincided with me being very lucky and being offered a job. There was a point in the early 80s when I did begin to think, this can't go on forever. I can't keep going to these places with these people and having a great time, because you're going to run out of road. And it did feel like it was time to grow up, I suppose.
But I want to ask you about this, because it almost seems to me that you've never lost your appetite for going out. Whereas Mark and I would rather.
We have. Oh God, I've got to go out tonight. Whereas you're permanently out, aren't you? Still.
No, that's not true. I think that's the. Yes, I enjoy going out, but I think we all hopefully make better and more precise choices the older we get. I think that
you're more discriminating about where you go. In fact,
well, yeah. And I think that is one of the possibly the only great benefit of lockdown, of COVID, was.
Go on.
Well, it's now I go out if it's very important for work. Yeah. Or I see my friends, and they used to be. And when I was at Condé Nast, I was very good at going out all the time, and I loved it, and I was very good at it. I don't particularly want to do that anymore, and I don't think it really matters what age you are. I think that there was a realization that that drive, in some respects, was slightly unnecessary, and also it felt to me very much leaving Condé Nast like that was an end of. An end of an era. I think, going back to your earlier question, Dave, about the book, my first agent, wonderful man called Ed Victor, who's a great friend, is sadly no longer with us. He said that, and I know this to be true because I worked on a couple of projects which didn't happen with some of these people. He said that most people leave their memoir far too late because these people think that by writing their memoir, it's a full stop, that their career is over. And I think you can point to many, particularly pop stars, because there's a long list of pop stars at a certain age who haven't done it, because I think they perhaps think that in order to write this book would be sort of tantamount to acknowledging the fact that their career is over. Although young people now have sort of 3 autobiographies.
It's absolutely,
yeah.
Wayne Rooney's I've got a shelf full of them.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about magazines. You're right. Obviously, you say a lot of this is about work, and it's about a lot of the work was magazines. And you've obviously, clearly, like Mark and myself, you've got great affection for kind of the atmosphere of magazine offices back in the day. Yeah. And how different they were from. I'm always rather amused when TV companies ring up and say, we're starting a drama based on a style magazine or a pop magazine or whatever they think. And I always think, you've no idea what it was like at all.
Yeah.
Go on, talk about this, because you talk about working on Arena and working with Nick Logan and Wagadon and so forth.
Well, there was working for, I mean, you know all these people very, very well. You know many of them better than I do, but it's working for Nick was just so much fun. And the thing that people never write about is the kind of giddy nature of what it was like. The fact that we would go to work, and I think that let me put it this way: the face, the sort of aura, the halo around the face was kind of huge in the mid-'80s, like it was for lots of the magazines that you guys worked on, like Q and Smash Hits, etc., etc. And we got a lot of attention, particularly from Asia, particularly from Japan. You know, and the people always coming to the office to interview Nick or Neville Brody, or very, very occasionally me. And I think because of the Face's influence and Nick Logan's sort of enigmatic persona, that when they came in, they expected to find sort of like, it's like the church of style, where everybody was walking around in comme des garçons and being very particular, you know, a room full of aesthetes. And what it was...
And also
like,
French cigarettes and green visors and, you know...
Polo necks and being
That's
very
right,
and ponderous, you know.
People having brilliant ideas off the top of their head. And
it was
the front page.
It was like the Bash Street Kids. I mean, it was hilarious. Yeah. And when we were working on the Face and Arena, there probably weren't more than about 8 people in the office at any one time, maybe 10. Our old friend Rod Stott wandering around telling a completely unpolitically correct joke.
This is our old ad man that we all so loved.
I mean, it was funny. I mean, I think that there's a sentence in the book that there were times working for Nick Logan where I thought I would never laugh this way again, because things are just so preposterous. Also, I think that there was, even though we were in this world, you know what it's like, you're in a bubble. And there were times when we were creating things and we just thought, if people only knew what it was really like in this office. And I mean, for instance, and the ribbing. I remember Neville Brody, who I love, he got very, very famous in the mid-'80s. And there will always be swarms of film crews coming to do little things for him. I remember he was in the office once. And I think Rod went up to him to ask him a question, and Neville turned around and said, "Not now, I'm filming." So forever he was no longer called Neville Brody. It was where's not I'm filming.
Not now, I'm filming.
Was his name. That became his name. And yeah, there were very giddy times and just great times, and we just had so much fun.
Right.
When you talk about GQ, there's moments you talk about scoops, i.e. things that you got that kind of were picked up by the rest of the press. William Hague drinking 14 pints, Nick Clegg sleeping with 30 women. They're just great stories. Can you remember any other times that you just got something that just then you travelled?
Well, it was all about. It was all about casting, and we alighted on politicians. Because I thought that if you populate the magazine full of politicians, you immediately open it up to a completely different demographic. Because before we arrived, GQ was a very, 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 very successful yuppie Bible, but it wasn't known for its journalism at all, and consequently, only certain people took notice of it. Plus, it was the period where in order to be successful, you had to have a scantily clad woman on the cover. So immediately, people's perceptions of what you were very prescribed, and we tried to change that. And I alighted on politicians because with entertainers and people in the pop industry or the movie industry, you know what, we've all had experience of how complicated and tricky it is, because there's always something you can't talk about. You've got to talk about the product, and it's you know, that the process is boring and tricky and not always successful. But with politicians, they're duty bound to answer any question you ask them, even if they tell you a blatant lie or an untruth or they prevaricate. So that seemed to be like a policy decision. And then hiring people like Piers Morgan and Alistair Campbell, who are Rottweilers, you got this very combative situation, like you often do on Sunday morning television. And politicians also are used to people being very aggressive towards them. So you could throw Piers into a room and with a politician, and it would be you knew you'd get a line out of it. I mean, there was once I was walking through the office, through the news and features department, and there was a press release lying on someone's desk, and it was that Alan Rushbridger had written a children's book, and we'd been trying to put Alan Rushbridger, the old ex-editor of The Guardian, together with Piers for ages. But Alan very wisely always said no. Yes, and I said that could be Piers. That could be good for Piers. And Stuart McGurk said, well, he'll never do it. I said, trust me, this is a really busy guy. He's done this book. He's going to do a day of interviews in a hotel room. He's not going to look at the list. He's just going to sit there and say the same thing to everybody. And so we applied for an interview. We got it. We couldn't quite believe it. And I would have loved to have seen the look on Alan Rusbridger's face when Piers walked in.
You? Yeah. Oh, who let you in?
But the other thing...
And then he talked to him for 90 minutes or something, didn't he?
Oh, it was extraordinary. I mean, if I'd have been Alan Rusbridger, I would have stood up, not said anything, and just walked out. But it became a very macho thing. It's really interesting, the psychology that big beasts didn't want to turn down the opportunity to meet Piers because they wanted to win. So whether it was Boris Johnson, it was Alan Rusbridger, or a big politician, they say, sod it, I am going to meet Piers Morgan and I'm going to beat Piers Morgan. And the thing is, they never, ever did. And Piers always came back with a line, and it usually had a number in it. Yes, as you say, the number of
pints.
William Hague drank as a boy, or the number of women that Nick Clegg slept with. I mean, it was funny.
I was intrigued to be reminded that the person who got the 13 pints line out of William Hague was Nicholas Coleridge.
Yeah,
is that right? I thought, if there's ever two people on earth who know nothing about drinking pints, it's Nicholas Coleridge and William Hague. That's a completely, it's a ridiculous conversation. You can make a film about it, but it happened.
Nicholas this is what people forgot about Nicholas, because Nicholas became very, very sort of overarching and he rose so quickly. To becoming an overseer, to being the managing director of Condé Nast. They forgot that he was a really good journalist, because Nicholas is a brilliant gossip, and he's a proper journalist.
He is,
and he William Hague, I think by mistake, sort of said this thing that when he was working for a brewery, they used to do so many deliveries, and you'd always have a pint with the people you delivered beers to. And you probably end up having 13 pints of beer in a day, or 13 or 14. And Nicholas, he just prodded. He went down that, and I think it's basically that thing where you've told someone a story, and it's not quite true, but it's easier to pursue this.
It is. It's easier to keep exaggerating it, to try and make somebody believe you. So it gets worse. It goes up from a gallon to kind of,
So this whole business of the kind of politics of fame is just an interesting thing. And it just talk to us a bit about the huge importance of the cover, in that vanished world of print magazines and so forth. And how it worked and how you use it as a negotiating tool and the problems you had and the triumphs you had. And go on, just talk to us about that.
Well, it became, as you know, it was such a prime piece of real estate that it all became about the cover, whether you were a fashion designer, a pop star, or more usually movie star. And if you couldn't give them a cover, that you had huge problems. You had to come up with such excuses about why you couldn't do something or why you couldn't put someone on the cover. And even towards the end of my tenure, when our website was fantastically successful, you could say, well, we could do the cover of the magazine, and that would be seen by about 120,000 people. Plus, if you take NRS figures, readership figures, it could possibly, in a perfect world, be seen by 800,000 people. If you did our website, we know it would be seen by millions, 10, 15 million people, and they would suck their teeth and say, no, what we really want is print. And also, something that I think is really interesting still, that the two sectors who remain obsessed with print are the Italian luxury goods industry and Hollywood. Again, they'll suck their teeth and say, well, actually, no, what we want is the cover, because particularly in Hollywood, they still want to be able to show someone their client.
Doesn't that work back from framed covers on a wall behind in a PR's office? I mean, it really does, doesn't it? Yeah. I put those people, and it doesn't have the same weight and gravitas if it's not actually on paper.
It really doesn't. It's quite extraordinary. But then, the wrangling that we used to do to get people, I mean, it was terrible. I mean, in the early days of GQ, we were very conniving and very sort of.
Surely not. I refuse to believe that. Go on.
And you wouldn't, you would tell people the truth, but perhaps you wouldn't tell people the complete truth. And when we were doing, I remember once when we were doing Men of the Year and our big Men of the Year award show, we used to do, we went from having group photographs where you do a composite of 20 people on a fold out cover to doing individual covers because it was easier. And I remember once we were celebrating a particular photographer, a world famous photographer. And he demanded that he wanted to be on the cover. We didn't want to put him on the cover, but that was a thing. So we that year, I think we probably did 8 or 9 different covers. No, 9 would have been silly. 7 or 8. I think 8 was the most we ever did. And we did the smallest run possible with this person on the cover. And
highly collectible.
And we knew where they lived. So we just put them in Holland Park. So if you went to the big W.H. Smith, it used to be Notting Hill, he would see himself on the front of the paper. But I doubt they were.
And what did David Bailey think about that?
I can't tell you that, but I can tell you what Mario Testino thought of that.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Very good.
Very good. So tell us the story of the Kylie cover of GQ from the beginning, because that doesn't start with, tell you what, Kylie, let's do a tennis tutorial as a pictorial. Where's that begin?
Kylie Minogue, who along with David Beckham featured on our front more than any other celebrity 7 or 8 times, I think 7. The first or second time we shot her, which will, and the fact that we shot her many times after that will validate my story. We were shooting her for the cover of the magazine, and Paul Solomons, our art director, came up with the idea of mimicking the famous 70s poster of a tennis player scratching her bottom. She's not wearing any underwear. And the shoot was done somewhere in the Hamptons, somewhere in Long Island. And it wasn't a particularly sunny day. It was quite brisk. It was chilly. There was a chill in the air. And they all knew that the idea was to have Kylie with an inference that she was not wearing any underwear. But because it was cold, We photographed her wearing her underwear, with everyone knowing that that these would be removed before publication.
She knew that, though, didn't she?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So this happened, and I can't remember if there was approval, but it was. We certainly.
That means there wasn't approval.
But this was a plan. We weren't being tricksy. I mean, we were tricksy in other occasions, but and I don't know how this happened, but I think as people do, and this happened a couple of times with Greta Scacchi when I was back at the Sunday Times. When people see the actuality, when people see the result of what you've done, they go, well, hold on a minute, I'm not sure about this. Yes. And there was a quote, and I think it must have been by Kylie saying, GQ removed my underwear without telling me. And this, in the days when stuff like this actually mattered to tabloid newspapers, was on the cover of The Star, The Mirror, The Sun for at least 2 days.
It's so rich coming from the tabloids too, isn't it?
Exactly. And I spoke to Kylie's PR at the time, and he was sort of protesting a little on behalf of Kylie.
But she was in the office. He was on the phone pretending to be really indignant about it.
But when I probably shouldn't say who it is, but we had this conversation, and we both agreed, look, this is great. Let's keep it going for a while. So we kept issuing contradictory press releases, one from GQ, one from Kylie's office, and it kept going for over a week. This just shows you what madness that world was. And I think that issue must have sold, I mean, we wouldn't have sold the entire print run, but we probably sold 145,000 copies. It was a huge success. It was mad. Yeah. But it was as I say, the fact that we then went on to shoot 5 or 6 times further to that shows that it wasn't the big do that it was. She was still talking to us, and then she actually, in latter days, she actually ended up having a relationship with the man who commissioned the photographs. So.
Oh, well.
Look what you started. I wanted to ask about, because it's so interesting, David and I have been in such similar positions as you on magazines, that idea of how you feel you're sometimes getting played by celebrities. I can remember at Q, Adrian Devoy going out and interviewing Keith Richards. And Keith Richards, at the end of the interview, said, when's the piece out? And he said, it's out on August 15th. He said, that's the day I'm going to be in London, Maybe we can go out for a drink. And that idea that Adrian then thought, oh my God, whatever critical thing I might have thought of putting in there, I don't want to put in now because I'd love to go and have a drink with Keith Richards. Of course, Keith Richards had no intention of ever doing that. But, so throughout the book, there's that element of you thinking, I've got to be clear in my head that I'm not becoming friends with whoever. Was there anybody that you felt you actually did develop a friendship with? David Bowie, for example.
No, I mean, I think you're very eloquent about this, but I know that you talk about Neil Tennant as being part of one of your friends, but it's fundamentally important that you knew these people before they become famous.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've got half a dozen friends who are famous, but I certainly never talk about them, and almost all of them were people I knew before they became famous. But it's very tricky, and I think if you get into this world in order to become friendly with celebrities, it's pretty sad. I think it's and I think there's 2 things here. I think that if you're attempting to start a relationship with someone, not a sexual relationship, but if you want friends with someone, that's pretty foolhardy. But I think the other thing is, and I've certainly been guilty of this in the past, and I still think I am to a certain extent with some people. You want to show off, you want to sort of say, I know your work better than you do. They don't care. They've got no interest in this. They just want you to be out of their orbit as soon as possible.
But also they're probably used to the fact that everybody who interviews them does exactly the same thing. There's just, you've got 10 people in an afternoon all coming in and immediately saying, do you know, I really love that, fill in name of rare B-side here. And you think, oh God, they've just got this off Wikipedia 10 minutes ago.
So, do you not find it interesting nowadays that just about every interview encounter a journalist on a national newspaper has or whatever with a film star or rock star or whatever, there will invariably be a selfie of the two of them together. Here's me with my new best mate, Keith Richard, fill-in name here, which all seems to be, at some level, a kind of betrayal of what you're supposed to be be
Yeah, how can you have any critical independence if you're wanting to have your arm around somebody?
You think that's... Go on.
I mean, I think that's marketing. I mean, I have this. I don't so much anymore, but I used to have this thing with my daughters, who I would criticize for using social media so much. And they say, "Well, you do it." I say, "It's a job. It's marketing. It's free PR." You know, if I post a picture, it's seen by 100,000 people. That's good. That's marketing, etc. You're selling something. I say I try not to define my life by things on social media, and I think it is a generational thing. I really, really do. I think it's a trite thing to talk about because it's such an obvious discussion. But I do think it's true, and cliches are cliches because they're true. And I do think that there are huge advantages to social media, but it has the potential to be so psychologically damaging. It really is. And context is everything. Talk about that thing you were talking about earlier. I remember once we sent, in terms of that whole thing about things taking too long, I remember we sent Jimmy Nesbitt to be photographed by David Bailey for some project he was doing. And we saw him at something afterwards, and I said, "How was it?" He said, "It's brilliant. It was quick."
Yeah, this is it.
Absolutely.
Get it over with.
Did you feel compromised by the fact that that it's quite hard to write kind of honestly about people if they're going to read it? You're very honest about David Bowie. David Bowie's not around to read it. And there are only, I think, about two people in the entire book that you genuinely appeared to dislike, and they were Russell Brand and Gwyneth Paltrow. But did you feel...
I said a friend of mine said that he's quite prominent in the music business. He said that he would never write. No, he didn't say it. Sorry, let me start again. He said that every good memoir involves a certain amount of treachery, and I said I don't think that's true. And I really hope. I mean, there's a couple of people I have a little couple digs at, but this book was not an attempt to settle scores. It wasn't an attempt to generate publicity by being mean about people. I really didn't want to do that. And I hope the impression is this. I haven't done the book to dump on people, friends, colleagues, ex-lovers, celebrities I had altercations with. It's not meant to be that kind of book. It's meant to be entertaining, but not at the cost of other people.
Well, there it is. Dylan Jones's book, These Foolish Things, a memoir, out now in his second printing. I see you published on social media this morning.
Already. Good work. Very nice to talk to you.
Well done.
Excellent.
Thank you, guys.